Today we're going to continue talking about angle pairs and their relationships. So we're going to first start by taking a look at linear pairs. So a linear pair, you'll remember these are two adjacent angles whose sides that they do not share form a line. Now the relationship between these, because they form a line, is that they are supplementary. So an example here would be angle 1 and angle 2. Those add up to 180. Angle 3 and angle 4 also add up to 180. You could also see 1 and 3 as being a linear pair, and 2 and 4 as also being a linear pair. Next we have vertical angles. Now vertical angles, you'll remember these are the ones that are across from each other and whose sides form opposite rays. Now vertical angles are going to be congruent to each other. So here, for example, angle 1 is congruent to angle 4, and angle 2 is congruent to angle 3. Let's continue with angle pairs that we talked about last time as they revert to transversals. So now if we have two parallel lines that are cut by a transversal, which is not always the case, but if they are parallel lines, then you know that corresponding angles are going to be congruent. So for example, angle 1 and angle 5 are congruent, angle 2 and angle 6 are congruent, 3 and 7 are congruent, and 4 and 8 are congruent. Next we have alternate interior angles. If you have parallel lines cut by a transversal, then alternate interior angles will be congruent as well. So in this case, angle 2 and 7 are congruent to each other, and angles 4 and 5 are congruent to each other. Next we have alternate exterior angles. So again, if you have two parallel lines cut by a transversal, then alternate exterior angles will also be congruent. So in this case, angle 1 and 8 are congruent to each other, and angle 3 and 6 are congruent to each other. Lastly, we have consecutive interior angles. Now, these are also known as same side interior angles. And instead of being congruent, if the two lines are parallel and are cut by a transversal, then consecutive interior angles are going to be supplementary. In other words, those two angles are going to add up to 180. So for example, angle 2 and angle 5 add to 180 degrees. Angle 4 and angle 7 also add up to 180 degrees. Alright, example 1. The measure of 3 of the numbered angles is 120 degrees. Identify the angles and explain your reasoning. Okay, so since we have, we'll call it angle 1, even though it's not labeled, the one that's in blue is 120 degrees. We know that angle 1 and angle 4 are congruent to each other because they are vertical angles. So angle 4 is 120 degrees. We can also say angle 5 is also 120 degrees because it is corresponding with angle 1, the 120 degree angle. And then angle 8 is alternate exterior angles with the labeled 120 degree angle. And so we know that is going to be congruent as well, so that will also be 120 degrees. Okay, example 2. So before we can determine the value of x, we have to determine, well, that 115 degree angle and the angle that's labeled x plus 5, how do they relate to one another? Well, since we know the 115 degree angle is congruent to the angle that's marked 4, because those are congruent, well, how do we know they're congruent? Because they are vertical angles. So we know that angle 4 is also 115 degrees. Now between angle 4 and the angle that's marked x plus 5 degrees, we know those are consecutive interior angles, which means that because we have lines A and B parallel to each other, and a transversal here going through both of those parallel lines, we know those consecutive interior angles are going to be supplementary, meaning they will add to 180 degrees. So the measure of angle 4 plus x plus 5 is equal to 180 degrees. And we know that the measure of angle 4 is equal to 115 degrees. And then we can go ahead and simplify. So we have x plus 120 equals 180, and then x equals 60. And here you're just asked to find the value of x, so you are all set. All right, let's look at example 3. Rain, different colors of light leave the drop at different angles. This process is what makes a rainbow. For violet light, the measure of angle 2, as is given in the diagram, is equal to 40 degrees. What is the measure of angle 1, and how do you know? You can see that the two yellow lines that are in the diagram are parallel to one another. They represent the sun's rays. Then we have this purple line here that's going through both of the parallel lines. And so we can say, well, since we have a transversal going through two parallel lines, and we know angle 1 and angle 2 are alternate interior angles, then we know that angle 1 and 2 must be congruent to each other, which means if angle 2 is 40 degrees, that means that angle 1 is also 40 degrees. So not a lot of math here, it's just a matter of identifying, and from there understanding, because we have parallel lines, we can relate those pairs of angles together, and in this case we know that they're congruent, so we know that the measure of angle 1 is 40 degrees. All right, example 4. Solve for x and y, then find the angle measures. So there are a number of things that we can conclude here from just simply seeing that we have two lines that are forming 4 different angles here. First, we know that we have vertical angles. Anytime we have vertical angles, they're opposite each other, they're going to be congruent. Second, we also have linear pairs. And linear pairs, we know when they add together, they equal 180. So we want to be clever about how we choose how to write our equations, in that we're trying to find x and we're trying to find y. So we want to be able to write equations that only involve x or only involve y. So although we could say 3x plus 5 is equal to 4y minus 15, that would still have two variables inside that equation. So instead, I'm going to use the fact that we have linear pairs. So the 3x plus 5 plus the x plus 15 will equal 180. So the measure of angle AED plus the measure of angle DEB is equal to 180 degrees. And then we can similarly do the same thing with the expressions that have y in them. So the measure of angle AEC plus the measure of angle CEB is equal to 180. All right, so now we can go ahead and substitute. So we have 3x plus 5 plus x plus 15 equals 180. And then we have 4x plus 20 equals 180. Subtract 20 from both sides. We have 4x equals 160, so we get x equals 40. We'll do the same thing with the expressions with y. So we have y plus 20 plus 4y minus 15 equals 180. Simplify that. We have 5y plus 5 equals 180. So 5y equals 175, and y is equal to 35. Now the problem says to solve for x and y, but then it also says to find the angle measures. So we'll go ahead and use what we just found for x and for y and plug that in. So the measure of angle AED is 3x plus 5, so 3 times 40 plus 5, which is equal to 125. The measure of angle DEB is x plus 15, so 40 plus 15, which is equal to 55. And from here you can actually pretty much get the rest of the angle measures, but just to be sure that we've gotten this right, we should expect to have 125 and 55 for the other two angles as well. So the measure of angle AEC is y plus 20, so that's 35 plus 20, which is equal to 55. And the measure of angle CEB is 4y minus 15, so 4 times 35 minus 15, which is equal to 125. So just as a check, we can see here that the vertical angles are congruent to each other. We have the 55 and the 55 degree angles congruent to each other, and 125 and 125, those vertical angles congruent to each other as well.